Okay, so I've got about 2 o'clock East Coast time, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the CUS Webinar Wednesday, Accessibility in Online Courses and Materials, Applying Universal Design for Learning. My name is Kelly McAllister and I'm the current chair of the College and University section of the North Carolina Library Association, and I am also your tech support. So please review the chat box for my contact information in case you are experiencing any technical difficulties. Please give me a call, shoot me an email if you have any problems logging in or staying in. If you are new to Zoom, please hover down to the bottom of your screen and choose the chat icon. This is where you are going to be posting all of your questions. In fact, once again, if you could just post your name and where you're from, if you haven't already, and also what your favorite restaurant is in your town. Due to the nature of the webinar, everyone except Samantha will be muted and all questions will be directed toward the chat box. At the end of the session, you may click on the raise hand icon and you will be unmuted in order to ask your question, or you can simply type in your question in the chat box. Please do not unmute yourself during the presentation. This way we don't have to worry about any pushback or background noise during the presentation. This session will be recorded and archived on the CUS website, which I am putting a link to right now in the chat box. Generally, I get to this about 24 hours, so you will receive a follow-up evaluation today. Just give me some time and we'll be posting up the archive as well as any handouts that Sam is going to share with us today. So again, like I said, they will be posted by the end of the week, promise. If you are also interested in presenting yourself, please check out our call for proposals also at the site that I just put on. We are always looking for proposals to share in any topic of librarianship, so please don't hesitate to turn in your presentation proposal. We would love to have you present. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Samantha Harlow from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro.
Okay, can you hear me?
Can hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. So, hi everyone. I was telling Kelly earlier that I do have a slight cold. I think it's one of those end of the summer colds, of course, when we're all really busy. So I apologize if I sneeze or sound, a little bit weird at any point, but it's still going to be awesome, hopefully. So this webinar is on accessibility in online courses and materials, applying universal design for learning. So, as Kelly said, my name is Samantha Harlow. I know there was a little bio about me, but I am the online learning librarian at UNC Greensboro in Greensboro, North Carolina. I think people are supposed to be putting their favorite restaurants. I love my neighborhood, so I'll pick one in my neighborhood. It's called Sticks and Stones. It's a pizza place. So I am the online learning librarian, but I've also been an instructional technologist, and I've worked in digital archives as well. I also teach online for UNCG for the LIS program and for some other stuff. So I think that means that hopefully I have a lot of hats so I can talk about these different things. So today we're going to take a quick poll just so I can kind of gauge who's here and what backgrounds you guys have in terms of where you work and for UDL. We're going to talk about why UDL matters, especially in its connection to accessibility and beyond. We're going to talk about applying UDL to library work, such as creating online materials and for your online instruction. And then we're going to talk about specific tools and strategies as well as takeaways and instruction. So, takeaways and questions. So, if you want to follow along, it's going to be on the CUS website, like she said, but here is also the tiny URL. If you like to follow along like that. It has some links in here, so that might be helpful for you to kind of play with stuff as we go. But there it is. So the first thing we're going to do is actually take a quick poll, if people don't mind. It's obviously optional, but here it is in the chat. And I'm just going to wait a couple minutes while people fill that out, again, if they want to. It will just help me kind of gauge where we're coming from and what your experience is in terms of creating online materials, online instruction, and if you have any questions or concerns about this webinar before we get started. Okay, so as the answers come in, I'm just showing you guys where we're all at. So it seems like we're mostly academic with some with community colleges. 100% of you so far are saying that you do create online materials at your library. Great. And then about half of you are doing instruction, a little bit more than half of you are doing online instruction, and some of you aren't. That's fine. There's still stuff to learn. One person said they could teach this webinar, so you should definitely chime in, which is great. And then some of you said you've heard of it and done a little bit of research, and some of you said I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it, which is great. That kind of helps me know how much to cover. And then, so captioning takes so long. We're going to talk a little bit about captioning different tools. We're going to talk about ADA compliance. That's great. We're going to talk about creating materials for other librarians. We're not going to talk a whole lot about institutional support, but maybe we can talk about that at the end. Audio descriptions, great. So yeah, great. Seems like we're all on the right track. And then in terms of what you guys want to learn, how to get started on applying UDL, something new, some design tips. Great. So I think we're going to cover a lot of ways to do this stuff. Some of you mentioned captions, so we can talk about that kind of at the end. I am going to talk a lot about tips and tricks in terms of creating online materials and using UDL in online instruction, but I'm going to give you links to a lot of stuff and talk about some stuff in terms of, you know, take-homes and what you guys can play with. So, good. Are there any questions? Okay, there's more online instruction. Are there any questions before we get started in terms of going back to this? Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about is universal design for learning. So because a lot of you said you've heard of it and done some research in it, I'm not going to harp in it, but it is an approach to curriculum that minimizes barriers and maximizes learning for all students. So if you don't know a lot about UDL, or if you want a refresher, this link is to a video. It's about 5 minutes about, you know, UDL at a glance, and I think it does a really good job of kind of covering the basics of what UDL is trying to accomplish as a framework. So the big thing about UDL is that there's 3 avenues of it. You're trying to provide multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. So when we're talking about multiple means of representation, we're talking about presenting content and information in multiple media and providing varied support. So using graphics and animations, highlighting the critical features, activate background knowledge and support vocabulary, so that students can acquire the knowledge being taught. So with action and expression, we're talking about giving students plenty of option for expressing what they know and provide models, feedback, and supports for their different levels of proficiency. And then in terms of providing multiple means of engagement, the big thing is what fires up one student won't fire up another. So giving them different choices, helping them take risk, and challenging them to try different methods of learning. So that's kind of the basic overview of what it is in terms of a framework and what it's trying to accomplish. So a lot of times when you talk about universal design for learning, people are talking about it in terms of designing an online course, or, you know, sometimes people talk about universal design in terms of designing a building or any kind of design in that way. But what we're going to talk about today is, as librarians, providing a method of using it in our creation of materials, which it seems like all of us are doing, and then in online instruction. So why does this matter? So a slide that I like to use is just that, of course, probably most of you know this, but just in case not, online education is on the rise. So more than 1 in 4 students, at least 28%, now take at least one distance education course. Public institutions command some of the largest portions of distance education students, and I would include community colleges in that as well. And then only about 30% of academic leaders report that their faculty accept the value of legitimacy of online education. So I think, again, those kind of stand out to me as important statistics, because that's where the library can be involved in supporting online education and providing materials for online education for our students, whether they are completely online students or just taking a course online or using our online materials. So of course, then it also matters because of the ACRL standards for distance learning libraries. So though this is about academic, this obviously can apply to everyone, that in terms of lifelong learning skills it's important, obviously, to provide to all students, including ones taking things or trying to access things online, which also includes information, computer, and digital literacy instruction, as well as, again, providing, creating things for online. So accessibility is what we're going to talk about next. So just some numbers I wanted to throw out here. I found this on the National Center for Education Statistics, and these are, for children 3 to 21 years old, but I do think that the numbers are significant because you can see that they've risen at points, but then also declined at points, which we're going to talk about maybe what that means. And then also I wanted to show the variety of what they're stating for disabilities. So you can see here there's stuff that probably we think about a lot, but a big part of Universal Design for Learning is thinking about all learners, which includes students with disabilities, but they include all things in disabilities such as learning disabilities. And you can see here that the largest number actually of reported disabilities are learning disabilities, coming in at over 2,000 students reporting it. And that's in 2013, 2014. That was the most current statistics I could find. I imagine it might have gone up or, stayed the same. But then also in 2013, 2014, which doesn't show on this chart, 13% of post-secondary students listed a disability on this list, or they were, claiming a disability. So something to talk about too is that not everyone is disclosing their disabilities. So I didn't really have time to find a really solid study, but I did find this article online that linked to studies that seemed pretty solid. But in this, they say that just 1/4 of students who receive help for their disabilities in high school acknowledge in college they need the same assistance. So there's still some stigma around claiming their disabilities for students, and I think that's important to keep in mind, that even knowing that the statistics are high of people who have different kind of disabilities that need different kind of learning styles and tools, there's a lot of people who aren't telling us even that they need it. So 94% of high school students report disabilities, whereas 17% of college students report disabilities, according to this study. So I think that's something to, again, keep in mind. So just at UNCG, where I am, I just wanted to show some statistics that we have through our accessibility website. You guys could obviously find this at each of your institutions, but it is interesting to note that, again, one of the higher ones is attention deficit disorder. And then again, if you look at medically and health impaired students, that's a really high as well, more than hearing impairment and visual impairment, which is, again, I think a lot of times what people think about when they're talking about accessibility. So of course, ADA compliance, talking about why does it matter and accessibility, it's important to note this because it is the law. So it is the law that we have to make everything accessible for everyone, including electronic. And this is important to note because not only is it, so should we be doing this for the right reasons of that we are educators and it's part of librarians' jobs to provide access for everyone, but it's also the law, and there are cases, which again we could look up, of schools being sued. So it's important to also keep that in mind in terms of, not getting sued. So accessibility is about more than just disabilities and ADA compliance as well. Remember, UDL is about, and accessibility is about making things accessible for everyone, including a variety of learners. So learners everywhere, or patrons everywhere, come from a diverse amount of backgrounds, ethnicities, gender, and more. So again, just to show this, I pulled up some UNCG demographics, and again, you can do this for your institutions, but some important thing to note is that we have a majority women, and we also are very diverse in terms of our race and ethnicity. We're one of the most diverse UNC of the UNC system. And then we also have 18% of students are 25 and older. So that means you're talking about adult learners and untraditional learners. So that's, again, something to think about in terms of learning styles and UDL. And then also 49% of our students are low-income students. So again, it's just a good thing to think in mind that we're not only talking about disabilities, but we're talking about providing the best method of learning for everyone. So another important thing to keep in mind in this is equity versus equality. So a lot of times people think about UDL and accessibility in terms of equality, which is that everyone gets the same resources. But what we really want to think about it is in terms of equity, and that each person gets the resources they need. So again, that can vary based on learning styles, backgrounds, and all that stuff. So, this cartoon is thrown out a lot, but it is the cartoon that kind of represents this. Equality is giving everyone the same thing, so the boxes are the same size, but equity would be giving people what they need in order to kind of reach the same goals or learning outcomes. And then, of course, all of this would apply to what we're doing online, whether creating materials. So online, it's the same stuff with the same disabilities, same demographics, and more. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is kind of taking universal design for learning. So the ideas of providing multiple means of representation, action and expression, and engagement, and talk about how we can apply that as librarians to creating online materials. So I'm not going to say this on every slide, but everything you make for an online environment needs to be accessible in terms of ADA compliance if it's going to live online. So just for example, if this Google slide is going to live online, which I believe it is, every image would have to have an alt tag. And we'll talk about at the end of this specific tools and strategies, but I did want to kind of talk about, again, more techniques in terms before I hit the tools. So of course, with creating online materials in libraries and then providing multiple means of representation, an important thing to do would be creating multiple forms of media. So everyone has a preference or a style of things that they create online, whether you usually like to use your LibGuides, Google Docs, websites, or create videos, prezis, etc. But as UDL shows, students need multiple forms of representation with online content. So some students might love a quick video, but others, again, to do with many different reasons of background, learning styles, disabilities, might prefer a guide or need a guide with hyperlinks and images. So sometimes it's not enough to just caption a video. You really need to think about creating a guide for people who maybe don't respond as well to that form of learning. So a lot of times what I do is I'll create a how-to video, but I'll also create a how-to guide, and I'll link it to YouTube with the captioning just so that they have kind of two forms of how to get the information, especially for how-tos, because captioning doesn't really solve the problem of someone who's visually impaired being able to follow what's going on. So think about that sometimes even the tools aren't enough. You have to kind of create different materials. So another thing would be thinking about providing different forms of media so that, you're varying your way you present your information. So, don't just create videos, also create text guides, also create websites, also create LibGuides if you have them or more. So another thing is to create multiple forms of action and expression when creating online materials. So creating interactive materials allows students to get involved in the materials instead of passively watching and reading, making it more likely for students to retain the information. It used to be that you needed to know how to code or to really work within the HTML to create interaction of online materials, or even have to buy, expensive things like Captivate or SoftChalk. But now there's a lot of free tools to help you with this process that don't require any coding, like H5P and more, like the interactive video tools like Edpuzzle. So the big thing about using free tools is to understand your limitation with the free account. So how many students can participate? What kind of data can you get out of these interactive things? And do students have to log in with an email address? Will it work on every browser and more? Of course, there are always ways you can create activities for more static things like LibGuides, websites, or even creating links in videos. There's things like hotspots instead of actually having quizzing go on in videos. But we'll talk more about that in the online instruction part coming up. So the next part is creating multiple forms of engagement for online materials. So beyond interactive modules and videos, you can also create activities online for students to complete and for you to gain pre and post knowledge, student assessment, and more. It's important to create interactive materials as a form of engagement when you're making online materials, because not every student likes to speak up through emailing you, through using your virtual chat services, etc. So creating materials that can engage students at their own pace, whether asynchronously or not, allows them to create a great way for us reaching out as librarians without putting the pressure of evaluation on students. One thing I always like to tell people, and I think about in terms of me creating engagement with my online materials, is that engagement doesn't always have to be about evaluation and students getting a grade. Sometimes the more you can engage them without putting that kind of pressure on them, the better, especially as librarians. So the next part is online instruction, which of course has many similarities to online materials, but we are going to try to talk about it a little differently. And then just to put the same thing I talked about before, in terms of your instruction also has to be ADA compliant and accessible, which we'll talk about some tools for you to check that at the end. But this we're going to talk about, what I consider what we're doing as librarians teaching online. So in terms of multiple forms of representation in your online instruction, it's pretty similar probably to what you're doing or what I would recommend with applying UDL to your FACE instruction, which would be about varying your teaching styles and activities when you're providing a lecture. So some examples of this would be chunking up your teaching to give all learners a chance to breathe and catch up. So taking a break, checking in with students, providing them activities so that it's not just a lecture for an hour or 30 minutes, or even sometimes 20 minutes can be too much depending on the learner. So thinking about ways you can quickly engage with your students through different forms of representation in your style of teaching can be great. Synchronous instruction can be varied through different forms of lectures and activities. It doesn't have to always be, again, a straight 1 hour lecture. And it's always good to start maybe with a definition, but then provide images, activities, and more to back up what you're doing. So another thing would be providing multiple means of representation of yourself. So, cover the material, but also let your students see who you are. If you like making jokes, then make jokes. But if you're not into jokes, don't force that upon them. Students like to kind of see your personality. But also not being afraid to share some personal information with your students also can help. So the next thing is thinking about online instruction in terms of action and expression. So this, again, would be really similar to creating online materials, but it would be the idea of using active learning activities throughout your instruction. So some examples would be using discussion boards, whether within your LMS or using tools like Padlet, to foster different forms of action and expression among the students, which can then help create community and make students feel more comfortable with each other and you as the teacher. Some other examples of ways you can encourage action and expression in an online environment, course, or session is to use polling through surveys or something like Padlet, like I mentioned before. Create group work and activities, so like a think, pair, share environment online, using things like Google Apps or whatever your school or institution uses for collaborative writing tools online. And then using things like breakout rooms, if you have that within your virtual meeting tools, like Zoom or WebEx, to create kind of group projects. And the last thing is talking about providing multiple means of engagement in your online instruction. So the big thing to keep in mind with this is that instruction can mean students engaging with each other in multiple ways, but it also means you as the instructor should not be passive in the process. So you can provide a space for students to engage with each other, letting them use the chat, group work, discussions, and more in the online environment. But as the instructor, you should try and give feedback throughout instruction, do check-ins to make sure students are following you or have questions, and follow up on activities done in the instruction. So, okay, so that's just kind of the part about like the tips and tricks. So someone chatted in and said that they have a highly international community and they've been told not to use humor with some of their international students because humor can cause a breakdown in communication. That's a great point. So definitely know your audience as well in terms of providing multiple means of representation. So that's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have anything they want to share about online instruction or online materials in terms of providing multiple means of this stuff. We're going to do an activity in a little bit to talk about, because I'm sure we're all doing it in different ways. So the now kind of more guide part of it, or how to help, how to create guides, how to engage other people, and how to learn about tools. So knowledge is power. The more you know about different accessibility tools or UDL tools or UDL strategies, the better you can make your online materials and your online learning. And again, as someone pointed out to me this morning when I was talking to them about this, you know, as librarians, I don't think we have a lot of time to comb the internet and try every tool. So sometimes it's just kind of nice to have people recommend things to you. So at my library, I do monitor all of the online materials that we make as a library. So I did create an accessibility guide that is linked in this presentation. But again, I think it's an example of you can look at what you're doing at your library and kind of, you know, again, apply things to what you're doing. So at our library, I kind of broke it down into useful guides on a lot of things online. Accessibility resources. Our LMS is Canvas, so I do have a section about accessibility in Canvas. There are tools that you can attach to your LMS that checks your accessibility, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Captioning. So I think a lot of you asked about captioning, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. You can learn how to caption depending, it just depends on your tool. So if you're making it in Camtasia, they have their own captioning tool that they have, you know, detailed instruction for things, but it's also not just about the captioning, it's about making your captioning ADA compliant. So I have some information on that here, and here's some information by TechSmith. That includes, like, you know, if you have music in your videos, you need to say that there is music and that kind of thing. It also provides you instructions on how to do it in YouTube, because again, captioning can be something that is time consuming and process, so sometimes we just have to get it done, and YouTube is a great way to do that. PDFs and plugins, looking at accessibility of those things. Alt tags, so images and graphics, including GIFs. I know those are used more and more. And then text fonts and colors, which is thinking a lot about color contrast, people with color blindness, and then people with partial sights. So again, I think everyone has to kind of think about their audience and what they're dealing with, and then, you know, kind of think about making a guide on their own too. But in terms of creating interaction, a lot of the stuff I talked about, I do create guides for librarians or for patrons in terms of interactive video, the different tools. So at UNCG, we do have some Camtasia. It's not like we don't have a university-wide license, but there are things like PlayPosit, Edpuzzle, Vialog, and H5P, which H5P doesn't just create videos, but it also lets you create interactive modules. So that's a pretty cool tool, and it's free. So VoiceThread, if you especially if you have access to that, and then of course linking back to the accessibility. Polling, there's many different things within that. And Google Slides, so all that stuff. And then Google on instruction. So using Google, or again, whatever collaborative writing tool you have to kind of create environments, group environments. So again, these are just examples of some guides I've made. The internet does have some good stuff, but this is me trying to pull together some of that for librarians or for our patrons. So some overall tools that I use, and I think a lot of people use in terms of talking about accessibility, are listed here. I'm not going to go into like a huge amount of detail, but you will get this afterwards. So you have a web AIM wave checker that will just check anything you make online and give you kind of a summary of accessibility issues with that. There are now many Chrome extensions that are free that help you create accessible materials and help you get access for your students in terms of accessible materials. And then you do it is, and I think it might be just for Canvas, but I'm sure like Blackboard and other LMSs have it, but it's an accessibility checker that you can put within your LMS to check your course and again, give you a summary. So for creating materials, we talked about it, but H5P, Edpuzzle, PlayPosit, things like that are free, and they allow you to create interactive content. And then YouTube CC has, is a great way to do that. But again, whatever you're using to create your videos typically come with a captioning tool. So it's also helpful to know about captioning and what is ADA compliant. So on here, there's also a link to the WebAIM guides, WebAIM. But they came about to really just deal with web accessibility. So they stand for Web Accessibility in Mind. But they are a great resource for guides, but also testing tools, checklists, things like that. So definitely go there to get started if you don't know much about accessibility, but also to test yourself. Here you can see you can download Wave from here, but it also talks about and breaks down how to deal with images, headings, contrast, HTML5, whatever it is you're working in, because we work in so many different forms. CAST is a great resource in terms of UDL. UDL kind of came out of a K-12 environment. It's been applied now to everyone. But so CAST is a little bit K-12 geared. Saying that, I think we can all learn from the stuff they've been doing here because they've been researching and working within UDL for years. So I love CAST. And then other resources are, CAST has a list of free learning tools that include a curriculum checker. If you are teaching courses online or involved in any kind of curriculum, it's a really great way for you to kind of check yourself and think about if you are using all these different means of representation, engagement, action, expression. NC State has a Center for Universal Design. It is more geared towards design of like space, but they do have many good definitions and resources in terms of just universal design. And then there is the National Center on UDL, which is linked to CAST. They're a part of CAST, but they do have guides and checkpoints for you to look at in terms of thinking about providing multiple means of representation, and then breaking it down into, again, even more perception, language, mathematical expression, symbols, and then comprehension. And then everyone has its own thing. So I see on here that someone asked, what about infographics? How does UDL work with infographics, and can screen readers read an infographic? So screen readers typically can only read whatever alt tag you put on your image, and an infographic is an image. So technically, to make an infographic completely accessible, you would have to put all the text and everything you're trying to represent within the alt text for the screen reader to work. So saying that, if you're going to provide an infographic, that's a great example of maybe that you would need a different form on top of the infographic. So an infographic could be a great way for students to learn about something, but also it might be good for you to provide a LibGuide with that in textual information and, images broken up to alt tag each image. So does that make sense? But that was a good question. Everything's a good question. And then someone said, Justin said to everyone, the new version of Chrome has an audit function as well in DevTools. Yes, they're coming out with tools all the time. This link here is just like to everything they have in terms of accessibility. So check it out. It's pretty cool. And like I said, you can see they're free. So like here's one that has like a read and write where you can, okay. So the next thing, we're pretty much done with all the content part. I don't really love to just like throw content at everyone, so I made a Padlet. So now that we know about UDL and we know about different strategies and we know about all this stuff, I thought it would be a fun activity to, go to this Padlet and kind of play around and talk about what we're doing in schools. And again, it's anonymous. You can put your name if you want, type of library, that kind of thing, or you could just kind of add ways to do that. Oh, so someone just asked about CC options within their like webinar tools, which, like right now we're in Zoom, so this person's talking about GoToMeeting. So that is a great point. There is, most virtual meeting tools come with a CC option, but what that means, because you're talking about live instruction, is that you would need a captioner in your session. So to caption in your session and have a captioner, what it means is that it creates a separate box from your chat that then a captioner would be able to put the words, like what I'm saying, in there. So the other option, of course, then would be recording and then creating the captions on your own. after that, afterwards. But to make it truly accessible, you'd have to provide access to someone who's audio impaired during the time, which would mean getting a captioner, which goes back to someone pointed out in the forum that working with other academic groups is really important. So, you know, that is something to think about. So like on campus, we have an Office of Accessibility and Resource Services where if you do declare your disability, you get an aid, and they would provide you services like closed captioning. So, you know, for webinars and that kind of thing. And they would help the instructors provide what is needed for the disability. But see, another part of the problem with that is that, you know, again, like I pointed out, not everyone's declaring their disability or difference in learning. It can be more. So someone asked about H5P on my WordPress to play with it. How do they host it at your library? So we actually are right now in the process of revamping our library tutorials. And we made the decision of doing it ourselves through working with people who do coding. But H5P is a nice alternative if you don't want to do it yourself. Where they do have their own admin controls, but you create a URL. But they also create embed code. So you can embed it then in a LibGuide or a URL, you know, whether it's a module or a video. So H5P is like they just basically create the HTML5 for you. So I would just recommend playing with it, and then once you play with it, they give you at the bottom, you know, all the hosting, you know, so like again, it's a URL or an embed code, but then see you have the admin controls on the H5P side when you sign up for an account. Does that make sense? So someone pointed out here, we're trying to encourage faculty to do machine-readable scans for course materials. That is a great thing to point out. So what she's talking about, or he or she is talking about, is that in academic, in this environment, in our environment, PDFs aren't always machine readable. What that means is they're not always OCR'd. So that means that screen readers couldn't read them. So something that we deal with at our library is that some PDFs, depending on the hosts of electronic articles, are OCR'd and accessible and some aren't. But if you scan anything like a chapter from a book, then it's definitely not. You would have to do it yourself. So if you have you know, any Acrobat tool beyond just like the basic reader, you can do OCRing on your PDF. There also is some free tools online, I think. So that's a good idea because a lot of times faculty just don't know. They just assume like anything they get, you know, from a PDF is accessible. So that's a good one. So someone says they have a campus-wide task force pulling accessibility and UDL information and resources together into a single website. So we're working on that at UNCG. We're actually in the process of hiring an accessibility coordinator who will hopefully like pull all the different resources together, because one of the issues that someone pointed out in the forum is that we have all these different people working on accessibility, but not necessarily one person who's like, this is what you should and shouldn't do. We're all just kind of learning on our own. We do have a lot of website information on creating an accessible website, but we don't really go beyond that in terms of creating online course design or anything like that. So a task force is a great idea. Someone said they held a workshop for librarians about accessibility and usability of LibGuides. Great idea. You can see on the guide that I made about accessibility, there is a section on LibGuides. They're pretty good in terms of accessibility because they are text-based. Screen readers can read them. The big thing would be images. You have to be careful, and especially GIFs, because I know people are doing GIFs more, or GIFs. I don't think I ever say it right. So someone said a set of LibGuide best practices. That's exactly what we're working on here. When I started, we had a lot of different online materials being made with no kind of monitoring. So what we are doing now is we're creating a best practices, and we're also creating a form where when you make something that goes online, whether it's for your LibGuide or whatever, you pull it through this form so that we have a consistent inventory that can be kind of somewhat monitored for accessibility and ADA compliance issues. So it's a slow start, but we're trying to work on that too. But it's good to think about like Runwave, alt text, etc. So someone said they're an accessibility work group. Yeah, great. UDL is a main component. And use Canvas. We should talk. So they're saying their distance learning department has an online courses, manually captioning videos or providing script for videos. Yeah, putting Word docs online. Okay, so great. thank you for everyone who participated in the Padlet. You're welcome to also, put anything in chat if you want to share. I know that I am not the only expert on UDL and accessibility. I wouldn't even call myself an expert. Someone's telling me privately that they like the idea of requiring OCR PDFs. We have some awesome scanners here that we can use for that. Someone talked also about Kaltura. So Kaltura is a video hosting platform that can be integrated within your LMS or, but it's not free. It's actually pretty expensive, but they do provide you tools for captioning, I think. We don't have Kaltura here. We are looking into video hosting platforms, but for now we're just kind of sticking with, kind of people are on their own. But we do have a cloud storage that is unlimited, so I think people use that a lot as well. But there is no captioning in that. You have to be careful because it's just cloud storage. Okay, so the important takeaways are, we covered all of this, but that UDL is about accessibility and taking away barriers for learning for all learners. So it's not just about, disabilities, it's about thinking about learners and the large variety that they come in. So UDL is not just about course design. We can also use it for creating online materials and planning for online instruction because it is a framework that can be applied to many different things. And UDL is important to implement in online learning, not just face-to-face because of the growing nature of things going online. So are there any questions?